Welcome back to our next historical table. Today we're going to talk about holidays. I'm Rachael A. Beyer, the John W. Emery family Assistant Curator of Oral History at History, Colorado. And today we're going to make honey fluff candy. And we're going to go back to the 1910s to find the recipe and to do it. So the 1910s in Colorado were very similar to that decade in other parts of the nation, because advertising was starting to become a daily part of lives for Coloradans in their newspapers, on the sides of buildings, and the birth of roadside signs as the automobile began to take root across the state. And this was happening elsewhere in the nation too. And so we really start to see this change in the way that we communicate with each other nationally. And we start to have a lot of things in common with each other. We're going to talk more about that during our program on December 1st. But today we're actually going to make some candy. So this recipe comes to us from the Ordway New Era newspaper here in Colorado from December of 1915. And the recipe was from an article called 2 Recipes for Homemade Candies, Good Ones to Use at Christmas Time. And we know that those are good things to use for all of our December holidays. So the 2 recipes were peanut creams and honey fluff candy. So I thought, let's make the honey fluff candy to kind of try to avoid some of those nut allergies if possible. Although you'll be able to find the recipe in the shared information in our program on December 1st. So if you want that peanut candy, that recipe will still be available to you. So to make the honey fluff candy, we actually start with just a few basic ingredients. We start with sugar, honey, water, lemon extract, egg whites, and if you want, some chopped nuts. So the first thing we're going to do is combine our honey, sugar, and water into a pan. And I've done that here. I'm just giving that a stir so that everything's kind of mixed together. And then we're going to bring that to a boil. Now, the one piece of specialized equipment that would be helpful for this recipe, but isn't necessary, and I'll show you how it isn't necessary, is if you have a candy thermometer. A candy thermometer would be very helpful because all we have to do is then stick it on the side of the pot, make sure that the tip of the thermometer is fully immersed in the liquid, but not touching the bottom. So I've got that angled in there so it's not touching the bottom of the pan, but it is fully immersed in the liquid. And I'm just going to leave that on the side of the pan during the boil. Now, if you do not have a candy thermometer, don't feel you have to rush out and get one. The original recipe for the honey fluff candy from 1915, nobody had candy thermometers back then. So what the original recipe says is it says, boil the honey, sugar, and water together until you can drop a little bit of the mixture into cold water and it'll harden into a ball. And in candy making, we just call that the firm ball stage, which is about 245 to 250 degrees. But because we're able to do that water test, if you don't have a candy thermometer, that's okay. So I'm going to go ahead and put this on the boil. While that's coming up to a boil, I'm going to go ahead and get my egg whites ready. And here I've just got the egg whites in a bowl. And I'm just going to beat those egg whites until they come to soft peaks, and then they're ready to go once the candy's ready. And you just get these soft peaks that form. So those are ready to go when our sugar, honey, and water temperature comes to 245 to 250 on the candy thermometer. You do not want to stir while you're doing this. If you've ever made caramel before, or you ever watched the Great British Baking Show, we know the rule of thumb is to not touch caramel until it's completely caramelized. You get that crystallization in the sugar. So let me bring you over to show you what that's currently looking like. I'm just going to lift that up just a little bit from the heat. I don't want it to overflow, so I'm going to reduce my heat just a little bit. You start getting this, we're at about 225. So we're almost there. Now I'm gonna get a bowl of cold water just so you can see what it looks like if you don't have a candy thermometer. Okay, so we just hit 245 in the candy thermometer. So I'm gonna check it by dropping a little bit into the bowl of water. Okay, so when I go in to the bowl of water and I pull up the candy, I'm actually able to roll it into a soft ball in my hands without it sticking all over my fingers. So I'm actually able to roll it into a soft ball, what I dripped in there. So it doesn't actually drop in as a ball, but when I grab it all with my fingers, I can just roll it into a ball that doesn't really stick. So we know it's done. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn this off and take it off of the heat. Okay, so let's go ahead and get this started. The next thing we are going to do is we're going to actually put a little bit of this into our egg whites, but we want to not do a lot at first because we cook the egg whites. So we want to just take a little bit of that and mix it into the egg whites because we're just letting those egg whites warm up a little bit. A lot of that will stick to the edge of the bowl. I'm going to do that one more time. Just to warm up the egg whites enough so we don't end up with hard-boiled eggs. I go one more. Give the egg whites a little feel with my finger to see where we're at temperature-wise. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're actually going to put the egg whites into that. We're going to just stir that in. Actually, I'm going to move into a bigger bowl. Now what we want to do is we actually want to beat the mixture until it's stiff enough to drop into little dollops for our candy, which will take a little bit of time because everything's quite hot. So before this cools down completely, we're going to add 1 teaspoon of lemon extract into our mix. You can use lemon juice. However, I have used lemon juice before, and every once in a while, I do end up with a little bit of a curdle. So as long as you know that going in, I'm not a big extract person myself, but I do use extract on this one just to prevent that occasional curdle. I'm not really sure what does that, but and the last thing that I'm going to do before this completely cools is I'm going to take the bowl and I'm going to put about half of it into a smaller bowl, because I like to make some of these with nuts, but I also know that not everyone likes or can tolerate nuts. So we're going to just halve the recipe. I've got chopped pecans. You can really add whatever you want, but I really like the pecans with the lemon extract and the honey. So I always add pecans, but you can add whatever you want. So now we have 2 batters. We've got the pecan and we've got the plain. When we're ready, we're going to go ahead and drop them onto a sheet of parchment paper. You can also drop them onto a buttered cookie sheet. They don't actually need to go in the oven. They're done at this point, other than the final shaping. But I always put mine on a cookie sheet because that's what I have that's big enough to kind of hold everything in place while they're cooling. The non-nuts is actually ready to go. Let me show you what that looks like. So we're starting to get, it's just kind of starting to clump up now. Instead of spreading back on itself, it's starting to be sticky and kind of clump up on itself. So now I'm going to go ahead and grab my cookie sheet And I have found that the best way to do this is with 2 spoons. Plus a little bit of cooking spray on the spoons. So I'm just going to put a little bit of cooking spray on the spoons to make them just a little bit slippery. And then I'm just going to do that. And you don't have to worry about spacing them out too much because we're not cooking them or baking them. They're going to stay in the shape that we leave them. I don't like to make them too big, just basically about a tablespoon, because they are very sweet, basically being just sugar. So let's get these nut ones done. But while I do, let me explain to you why it was that candy companies offered pure candy. Well, prior to 1906, food companies could advertise food any way they wanted to. And part of that advertising was to get people to buy their food, of course. Advertising was brand new, and companies were completely unregulated. And so what was happening was there was a lot of adulterated food out there. Adulterating meaning that there was some sort of addition to the food that made it not the original food. So for example, the 2 most famous ones were that baking powder companies would add talc, the stuff that's used for baby powder that comes out of mountains. They would add talc to their baking powder as a filler because it was way cheaper than making baking powder. Now, that seems kind of outrageous enough. But what was really outrageous was that dairy companies would add formaldehyde to their milk. So milk was, there was a disease called bovine tuberculosis that was in milk. And oftentimes people who lived in the city who bought their milk would find when they would purchase it, or when they would be dropped off at their homes, or when they would purchase it at the store, it would be blue or green because it had bacteria and disease in it. And formaldehyde got rid of that color, but it didn't get rid of the disease. So a lot of sick people, babies were lost because of that. And so, and then following in the wake of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, which was on the meatpacking industry, people really felt like between the advertising and The Jungle and a lot of other things going on at the time with food, that somebody needed to regulate it. And so this is when the Food and Drug Administration was born in 1906. Candies, along with many other food products, were regulated by the FDA. And so companies that made candy could now advertise that their foods were safe and healthful because they were regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, which of course makes its way from Washington all the way into Colorado's small town newspapers. So in this particular ad from the Chronicle News of December 1911, it says, "Masons, purity and cleanliness are hobby. The purity is guaranteed and it is made in your hometown, which ensures absolute freshness." So, so candy companies were not shy about using the fact that they were regulated by the FDA to advertise their candies to people. And I've also included an image of one of the candy dishes from our collection. This is one of my favorites. It's from around the 1910s. And it's this really pretty flower petal design with this great carnival glass. So, so that is why candy companies could advertise purity and cleanliness in their advertisements. Now we are going to move on to the White Mountain cake. But before we do, I want to show you our candies, which I made yesterday and for us just a moment ago. But I want to show you the candies when they're finished. We've got the plain and then the nut. And they're very super lightweight, fluffy, airy candies that just sort of melt in your mouth, almost like a buttermint, which makes them really, really tasty and delightful to have for the holidays. So the first thing that we're going to do with our White Mountain cake is we are going to start by creaming together our sugar and our butter. Once we have reached that crumbly consistency, we are going to set that aside. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to beat our egg whites until they form stiff peaks. Let's start on a low speed just to get things started before bumping it up. Okay, so that's some pretty stiff peaks we've got there. So I think we are set to go with our egg whites. Now it's just a matter of folding everything together. And while we do that, I will warn you that this is the driest cake batter mixture I have ever seen. Normally cake batter is quite soft and runny. This cake is not, which to me says a lot about the way that people used to eat cakes 100 years ago. So anyway, we're going to go ahead and start combining things. And while we do that, let me tell you why the cake is called White Mountain. And maybe it's not, maybe it'll be a little surprising to you. So into this butter and sugar mixture, we're going to add our flour baking powder combination. And I've got whole milk here that I'm going to use. And we're just going to alternate that a little bit at a time, dry, wet, dry, wet. So the White Mountain cake is actually named after not our mountains here in Colorado. The White Mountain cake is named after the White Mountains, the mountain range in New Hampshire. However, this cake was extraordinarily popular in Colorado in the 1910s. Probably because, oh gosh, maybe it's because we also have White Mountains here. So, and you'll see why it's called a White Mountain cake when we pull it out of the oven and show you the final cake. It actually does look a bit like mountains. So it's very popular here in Colorado, shows up in numerous newspapers across the state during the 1910s. And a number of recipe variations. In fact, part of my experimenting for this program was to try out the 4 or 5 very, very different recipes that I found on the White Mountain cake. It seems to be that the common denominator is how it looks at the end rather than the actual ingredients in the cake. And so this particular recipe that we're using today calls for 4 egg whites. However, one of the recipes that we found that I've shared on the screen at the beginning when I showed the recipes was a recipe that called for just egg yolks. And I will tell you, I did not care for that particular recipe. It was almost like cornbread. Super crumbly and dry. And so I did not care for that recipe. So that one immediately was struck out. But this one I think is pretty good. So once you've mixed in all of your flour baking powder mixture, as well as the milk, you're still getting this really dry, almost biscuit-like texture. Now we are going to add in the vanilla. One teaspoon of that. We're going to add in our egg whites. And you want to be careful to add these in quite gently, which is a little difficult because the mixture is so dry. But we're going to just do this really soft and gently. Get a little bit of those in to start, and then I'm just going to push the rest in. And we just want to do this really gently. Okay, this is our final product. You're going to see that it looks almost like a cookie dough. It's going to be thick, thick like a cookie dough. So the last thing we want to do is get this into our pans. Now I promise I washed my hands at the beginning of this. So the next thing we want to do is get this into our pans. And one of the signature attributes, I'm using a bundt cake pan because I love bundt pans. But the original recipe calls for a loaf pan, or you can also put this into muffin tins if you want smaller individual portions. I've pre-buttered my tin. Now, one of the attributes of this recipe that makes it look like a mountain cake are the raisins. And you don't have to put raisins on if you don't want to, but I like to because it gives a nice visual to the look. So what I did was take 2 to 3 tablespoons of raisins, optional raisins, and I tossed them in some flour. And I'm just going to gently shake off the flour, and I'm going to just put them into the bottom of the pan so that when the cake comes out, the raisins will be sitting on top like little white frosted boulders on top of a mountain. Then I'm just going to take this and I'm going to just kind of layer it. And I have a very big bundt pan here, so it's actually not going to come up very high on the sides. But I'm just going to layer this dough into the pan, gently pushing that down into the base of the pan so that we get the nice ridges on it. And now we can go ahead and stick it into the oven. I preheated to 350 degrees, so that's ready to go into the oven. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to leave that for 25 to 30 minutes for muffins, or 30 to 40 minutes for a loaf pan. Because I'm using a bundt, it's going to be somewhere in between that 25 to 40 minutes. So I'm just going to keep an eye on it. And when a knife or a chopstick comes out clean from the center, you know that your cake is done and you can pull it out of the oven. So after 35 minutes, the knife came out clean. So I pulled the cake out of the oven and it's just resting in its pan, the cooling rack. I'm gonna leave that for 10-15 minutes before I flip it over. In the meantime, we can get started on our frosting. And for our frosting, we're going to do a boiled frosting recipe, which was a recipe that came out of the newspaper from the 1910s again. And all we're going to do is combine 1 cup of sugar and 1/4 cup of water in a saucepan, and we're going to bring that to a boil. And we're going to do the same thing that we did with our honey fluff candy yesterday when we brought our sugar mixture to a boil, and that is nothing. We're going to leave it. We're not going to stir it or touch it at all because we don't want those. We don't want to stick anything in the pan that's going to allow the sugar crystals to recrystallize while everything's melting. Once I've reduced this to a honey-like consistency, like 4 or 5 minutes boiling, I'm going to turn off the heat and I'm just going to remove it from the heat. Give it a chance to cool a little bit. So as that's cooling down, we're going to take our 1 egg white and we're going to beat it until it's light. That's all I'm going to go on that. It just says beat until light. Now, what we want to do is we want to add a little bit of this into the egg whites, a little bit at a time. And just kind of mix that together. Because we need to heat up the egg whites just a little bit at a time so we don't end up with cooked egg whites. And then we can add all of it in. Now, you'll notice that the recipe says until you get hairs. Just get a little bit of that. It'll form kind of threads a little bit. I'm just going to stir this until it starts getting shiny. Now, boiled frosting needs to be put over the cake pretty quickly once you have made it, because otherwise it'll get hard. So I'm going to go ahead and grab a plate. to turn my cake over onto. The bundt pan, I always like to poke around the edges with a toothpick just to make sure it loosens. No problem at all. Okay, so here is what the cake looks like. You've got the raisins around the top. Then I'm going to go ahead and just pour it over the top. Okay, so there is our finished White Mountain cake. And you can see why, I think, with the finished product, why Coloradans have really enjoyed this recipe, because it looks a little bit like our mountain peaks. Looks a little bit like our mountain peaks in the winter. So I hope that you have enjoyed this episode of Historical Table Holidays, and that this video has given you ideas for ways to celebrate with food and to enjoy the holidays in a winter setting with our honey fluff candy and with our White Mountain cake with boiled frosting. As always, thank you so much for joining us at History Colorado with this program, to be able to invite you into our archives and to share some time with you at this holiday. My name is Rachael A. Beyer, and I'm the John W. Emery Family Assistant Curator of Oral History. Thank you so much for joining us, and a very happy holidays to you and yours.